Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Really appreciate you being here to hear a little bit about a new report that we're rolling out and a couple of other products that we're going to show you today, and then to get to the real fun, which is our panel discussion with our illustrious guests. I'll begin, as we always do, with our security announcement. We have a safe and secure facility, which is the good news. However, if there were any need for us to leave this venue during the event, I'll be your security officer and give you guidance either to go out the way you came in or to go out the back, depending on what situation we're in. And I also want to let you know that today's event is supported by general support to CSIS by CSIS members. We don't have any specific sponsorship for the work that I'm going to show you today. I want to move into first a video that we would like to show you. And this is a video that we prepared as something that those who are curious about defense acquisition, have heard about it, want to know more about how the system works, can watch. Most of the folks in this room probably have a level of knowledge about the system that is in detail beyond what's in this video, but we think it's going to be useful for people who are trying to get a baseline understanding of the defense acquisition system and how it works. So without further ado, I'll ask folks to start the video.
The defense acquisition system has given the United States military an unmatched technological advantage for over 70 years. Along with its legendary complexity, it's brought us the Abrams tanks, the nuclear aircraft carrier, the amphibious assault vehicle, and the B-2 bomber. Today it spends more than $300 billion a year, nearly 3 times as much as Amazon's annual worldwide sales. Over 150,000 people and almost 2,000 pages of rules are employed to make sure that money buys what the military needs. And much like Amazon, you can find just about anything in DoD shopping cart. How hard is it to buy all that? Exhibit A, this simple 500-element flowchart that explains how the defense acquisition system works. Let's take a closer look at that framework, though. There are 3 fundamental elements for every acquisition: a need, an appropriation, and a contract. The requirements process defines the need, which is often called a statement of work. The budget process generates the funding, and the contracting process buys the product or service from industry. This structure holds equally for all things in DoD shopping cart, from the simplest to the most complex. For the simplest things, the process can be performed by one government professional in a few days with a requisition order or need, a government purchase card, or funding, and a bill of sale, or contract. For the most complex acquisitions, hundreds of people are involved in every step of the process over a period of decades. Let's apply this underlying structure to the Pentagon's most complex acquisition program, the Joint Strike Fighter, or F-35. First, the need. In 2000, the Air Force, Navy, and the Marine Corps produced a statement of work for the F-35, also known as an Operational Requirements Document. While there have been some important changes to the document, these basic requirements remain the standard against which the program is judged. Second, the contract. A year later, the DoD awarded Lockheed Martin a contract to develop the F-35 with 3 variants, one for each service. And while Lockheed has been awarded several F-35 related contracts, this initial contract remains in place to this day. Third, the funding. Since the decisive competition kicked off in 1997, Congress has provided 20 years of appropriations for the F-35. The estimated total budget is more than $1 trillion, which includes all the money necessary to develop, produce, and operate thousands of this aircraft for over 50 years. To date, however, only about 10% of that amount has actually been spent. In other words, the F-35 is only now moving past its initial stages. This 3-part underlying structure gives us insight into what makes acquisition work better. As the F-35 illustrates, a well-understood requirement, a clear contract that aligns contractor and government interests, and a realistic budget are crucial building blocks to set early on in the process. Even as we seek new approaches to acquisition, these critical elements will continue to form the foundation of any successful acquisition system.
Okay, now I'm going to turn to the findings of our report that is being released today called Defense Acquisition Trends 2016, with the subtitle, The End of the Contracting Drawdown. We were going to go for something a little more Star Wars, but we decided to keep it more CSIS appropriate and slightly boring. What I'm also going to do as I walk through our major findings is try to utilize a tool that we're also rolling out today on our website. This is the Defense360 website, our microsite for our core and major defense products that we're putting out. And what it allows you to do is access the contract data that we use to do our analysis and do your own analysis, and basically to parse and meter the data to answer the question that's of interest to you. So I'm going to try and display that a little bit as I go through our major findings so you can see how it works. And we welcome everyone in the public to use that and access it from our website. First slide, and this one actually is a slide and not from our tool, because we don't have a way to show this in our tool yet, although we're going to get there. But there's a brief point that I want to make at the start to put kind of the acquisition system again in the context of the broader DoD budget by showing you, and this is a slide you won't often see. What it shows is total net DoD obligations against contract obligations. So it's an apples to apples comparisons. It's a case of obligations to obligations. Normally what you see is budget versus contract obligations, which is useful and insightful, but a little bit of apples and oranges, because budget authority and obligations aren't the same thing, although they're related. And what you see, and just the point that I want to highlight on this chart, is that contract spending as a share of all DoD spending has significantly declined. So in the peak years of the war effort, 2008, 2009, it was about 56% of all of DoD's obligations were contract obligations. The rest obviously being obligations for things like personnel costs that don't go outside the walls of the Pentagon and other internal costs. And that figure has declined now to where it's a little bit over 46%. So almost, if you will, the market share of the DoD budget that goes to contract spending has declined by about 10%. Now, we don't know for sure whether that is going to turn around or change now that the budget's starting to grow again. But it is a huge difference, and I think of great interest, certainly to defense industry, about the opportunity for them in the DoD budget. Now we're going to turn to our web tool and show you a little bit about how that works. And talk about the major findings in our report. When we have now put in the 2016 data, which becomes available to us, contract data, which becomes available to us right around the end of February is when it's final, or maybe it's the end of January, start of February is when that data becomes available to us to begin analysis. So a lot of the analysis in our report goes up through 2015, and then we have kind of a smidgen of the work on the 2016 data that we were able to do when it became available. And so what you're seeing here is a view from our web tool. You can see the URL address up at the top to tell you that we're looking at something off the web page. You don't have to write that down, though. You can get to it, as I said, through our D360 website. And so just going to start with our major finding, which is, lo and behold, that contract spending increased in 2016 for the first time since the peak year in 2008. And it went up 7%. Which is actually definitely exceeded my expectations. So we knew the budget turned around and starting in 2015, and you knew that it would eventually show up in the contract data, but the 7% increase in 2016 definitely exceeded my expectations. The other thing I want to point out from this view, if you look at the products, which is the orange, if you hover over that, you can get the actual number displayed. This increase was driven by products. So the R&D contract spending is flat. The services spending is modestly higher, but very modestly higher. But there's a pretty big uptick in the spending on products. That has driven the contract spending increase in 2016. I want to turn now and look a little bit at R&D. We released a report last fall about R&D, highlighting what we call the trough in the weapon systems acquisition pipeline, which at the time we described as a 6-year trough. It is now a 7-year trough. So notwithstanding the fact that there was a pretty significant increase in contract spending in 2016, R&D contract spending did not increase, and the particular stage of contract spending, which we call the weapon systems pipeline, particularly the 6.5 account for SDD, it continues to decline. Now, one of the things you can do with this tool that Gabe is showing us is you can click on the sub-elements, in this case SDD 6.5, and see the trend line for just that element. And as you can see, we are in what is now actually, I have focused on the 2009 to 2016 period. Now that we've shown this trend line, I'm seeing for the first time that it goes back to 2006. So we've called it a 7-year trough. Maybe I have to start saying a 9-year trough. But you can see that the development of new weapon systems has simply has been decreasing increasingly over time, and there's no recovery yet in sight. And that'll be a real issue for the new administration coming in. Next, I want to show you a little bit about the state of defense industry. And I'm just going to hit a few of the highlights here. And in general, this is market share by vendor size. So we try to analyze what's happening in industry largely by looking at breaking down industry between the big 5 contractors, the Boeings, Northrops, Raytheon, General Dynamics, that are the industry leaders and the biggest companies. Then you see large, which is any company that is over, I believe it's $1 billion in revenue. Medium is anyone who is between large and small is people who are registered as small in FPDS. They meet the statutory definition. And so what you see for the most part with some overflow between large and medium, but it's a pretty static picture as you look across the time frame. And this range is from 2000 to 2016. One thing I want to point out about the tool is if you wanted to, you can alter the range for whatever time period you're interested in looking at. But over the period, it's pretty static. But then, interestingly enough, right as you get to where we are today, 2015 and 2016, you start to see some shifts. You start to see a big increase in small business participation starting in 2015. You see what I believe, what you're really seeing, that big uptick on the big 5 at the end is Lockheed Martin's purchase of Sikorsky, and the 2016 showing the Sikorsky numbers as part of Lockheed's numbers. There may be some additional factors in that. But that static picture that's been largely static since the end of the drawdown from the Cold War, it's moving. It looks like the data is starting to move. Something is happening. It's a little early to tell exactly what's happening, but something's happening. And then I just want to show you, if we're going to narrow it down, and so we're going to come over here on the left where the categories are and pick R&D, and you see that that's very, very much not a static picture. And what you see is if you look specifically at R&D contracts, the market share of the big 5 companies has declined very dramatically. And this is intimately related to that trough in the weapon systems pipeline that I talked about earlier. If you are, if the big ship and aircraft R&D contracts are declining, as they have been, then you're going to see a decline in the market share of research and development for the big 5, and that is, in fact, what you see. But it's also interesting that that small business has increased so much in this area of the market. All right, last I'm going to do on my highlights, and then we'll get to the good stuff of the panel discussion, is a little bit, and this is going back to the slides now because we haven't been able to put this data into our web tool yet, is work that we did in this report that you'll find in there, trying to use our data, FPDS contract data, to evaluate the claims of a certain person who's here with us, Frank Kendall, about the performance of the Defense Acquisition System. So we got curious, because he has done a lot of work in the report that was put out by DoD on the performance of the acquisition system, to see whether our data showed a similar story or a different story. And the bottom line up front is that our data shows a similar story, that there has been a shift in performance of the Defense Acquisition System. Now, how do you measure that in FPDS? Well, we look at 2 things that we can actually tell in FPDS, because FPDS, as many of you may know, doesn't have performance data in it. No one goes in there and says this was a good contract or a bad contract. But there are 2 things we can draw from it. One is we know if it's been terminated before it was supposed to be completed. So we can look at contract terminations, and we can look at whether the original estimate for how much it was going to cost, whether we ended up spending more on the contract when it concluded than that original estimate. And what you see here, and this is a little bit of an eye chart, so I'm just going to kind of tell you, and you can study it at your leisure in the report, which hopefully you grabbed on the way in. This is looking at terminations. And what you see, basically the red lines are terminations, and we have to do a little bit of estimating here because as you get close to where we are today for longer running contracts, right, there's a little bit of a skew because if it's a 5-year contract and it terminates in year 4, or it's going to terminate in year 4, we don't know that yet. So you have to do a little bit of projection to make an apples to apples comparison. But basically the distance between the red line and the blue line shows a change in performance for the better, because that means that a smaller share of your contracts are terminating before they were originally projected. And what you see, particularly for large, long duration contracts, what you see on the bottom right chart, is that that distance has grown significantly since 2012. And so there are fewer terminations happening early. Now, any given contract may terminate for a reason not having to do with bad performance, but when you look at thousands and in fact millions of contracts as you do in FPDS, I think that's a significant trend. Next slide. This is on ceiling breaches. And so I'll briefly describe this. The different colors show you the different percentiles. So for contracts that have really massive breaches, those are in the 95th percentile, right? The very highest of all those. And then you get the different colors represent different percentiles. And then the percentages, what you're seeing measured then is if I'm the 95th percentile violator, if you will, or cost breacher, how big was my breach? And what you see is that the 95th percentile breach has come down quite a bit over time, particularly since 2010. And what does that mean? That basically means that the outliers, the contracts that perform really poorly and dramatically overshoot their initial cost ceilings, have dramatically reduced. And what you'll see if you work on cost growth in DoDs, it's really the outliers that tend to drive the bulk of the cost growth. And so that's what I have for you in terms of just a quick look at the major findings of our report. There's a lot more in there on acquisition reform, on innovation, on competition, and all the things we usually look at, services contracting. But rather than march you through all that, what I would prefer to do is bring our panelists up and talk a little bit to you about the prospects for defense acquisition in the new administration. So by the way, there was a big betting pool on how far over my time limit I was going to go. So I'm not sure who won in the pool, guys, but let us know later. I have 3 folks here who almost need no introduction, but I will introduce them nonetheless. We have, to my left, Kath Hicks, Senior Vice President and Director of the International Security Program here at CSIS, and also a Senior Fellow in the National Security Program. To her left, Frank Kendall, private citizen, former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology
Senior
and Logistics.
advisor at CSIS.
And a senior advisor at CSIS. Recently joined us in that capacity. And I know everyone's going to be curious about the ARM. And I have been authorized to reveal that if you're wondering how it is that Army beat Navy this year, they had a secret competitor in the game, but it was not without its costs. So. And then to his left, Sean O'Keefe, who has had almost every job in government it is possible to have. He's been a service secretary, director at OMB. He has been a comptroller, director of NASA, president of a university, and is now also a senior advisor here at CSIS. So thank you all for joining us. And I'm just going to start with some questions to get the discussion going. Kath, I'll start with you.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm going to start with Sean. My apologies.
No.
Sean, with your expertise in particular on budgets and spending, one of the big questions that's out there in town right now is that where is the budget going and what does it mean for contract spending for industry and for acquisition? We see already that before the new administration came in, we have this uptick as a result of the some relief being given under the Budget Control Act, that budgets have started to go up and that contract spending has started to go up. But the question now really is what's the trajectory that is going to take. And I'd be interested in your views. We know the new administration has staked out that they would like to make a significant increase in the defense budget in this year and in next year and hopefully going forward. But what is your view of what the prospects for success are? How likely is it that we're going to see a sharp uptick in defense spending and in the opportunities for industry?
Sure. Well, at this stage, I think the mechanics of how all this is going to work are largely unknown, because inasmuch as there is a strong indication of a desire on the part of the new administration to increase defense spending, its basic mission objective is to rebuild the military. That leaves an awful lot of room for interpretation of how that would be accomplished, what it would mean, what the preferences are, and so forth. And at this stage, I think just to really set the backdrop for how this would affect any individual segment, acquisition in particular, of the defense budget, you got to look to the broader question of, well, what's the strategy? And so far that hasn't been articulated beyond rebuilding the military. And that's, again, motivates a large debate about exactly how to accomplish that. The major specific certainly has been more operational in nature of how that's been articulated, which is to defeat ISIS, another very broad-based kind of a mission objective statement. So far we're kind of reaching to determine what the objectives would be, exactly how to focus that, where would the growth occur. And yet, at the same time, the very lovingly referred to skinny budget that has come forward would suggest that there will be an increase, rather substantial one, in defense. Given that backdrop, just a week ago, with the Senate Armed Services Committee, the vice chiefs all testified to the proposition that a baseline budget would be woefully deficient, that the current standing of operational readiness is very low, that the capacity to recapitalize is severely depleted, and that an increase to what has been proposed by the administration formally will do a marginal improvement to begin that rebuilding, if you will. And further, that if you were even to try to reach the point that I think the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate has articulated as being a much more robust level, they would view that as still deficient relative to the unfunded requirements. So what we're having is a replay of a relatively every 4-year debate, if not more frequently, which is that the size of the unfunded requirements will always exceed whatever the amount is that's determined to be part of any budgetary framework. And absent a strategy which specifically articulates where those priorities would be on whatever increase from a current level or a baseline that you would seek to pursue, that then it becomes an auction, or it becomes a circumstance in which everything improves marginally, but none of it successfully in order to achieve any goal that might be articulated moving forward. So with that backdrop in mind, looking at the kind of usual mechanical problems that we've been dealing with in the last few years that would impede any position you take, whatever number that would be, whether that amount would, whatever increase would be allocated towards increased defense spending. Certainly the one that is the most often cited as an impediment is the continuing existence of the sequestration position. Absent a repeal of that position, I can't imagine that any individual part of a defense budget, be it operational in nature or be it acquisition investment related, is going to benefit because of the blind nature of how that sequestration model is applied. It must, by definition, be taken without regard to whether its priority is high or low, or whether it's an investment or an operation, and therefore reduced by a commensurate mindless percentage derived by a computer model, period, end of statement. It can't be subjective in any way, shape, or form. So as a consequence, that there's short of seeing that repealed, you're going to continually see everything marginally improving, I think, in some respects, regardless of how much you're talking about, and none of it to the point of relieving any of the deficiencies that are identified. The second major impediment, I think, that is also one that's on the table now that's being debated as an opportunity to really reestablish a baseline or a determination of cost, is discussion of whether or not continuing overseas contingency operations need to continue as a separate line item, the OCO funding. Is that a necessary condition? And there's a stronger argument today for saying, no, this is now time to reset this, is it was devised primarily as a means to recognize what operational costs would be different in a circumstance in which the forces are being deployed and being used in warfighting conflict situations relative to what its normal base would be in order to operate, train, equip, et cetera, to move forward. Well, after 16 years of continuing operations, I think we've seen that that is now part of the omnipresent condition and hard to distinguish. But what is particularly difficult, and maybe the greatest leadership and management problem that I think the department will confront on this question, is how do you break the culture of OCO within the Defense Department, where there's an artificial distinguishing between whether or not you're operating today on something that just simply is training, sustainment, or basic operational capacity versus in support of conflict situations. There's a value judgment that's placed to that, and yet the price of the gallon of gas that goes into that flight can't be discriminated based on whether or not it's being deployed in one area or another. It's blind to that proposition. So whether you need 20 or 21 or 25 or 30 hours a month of operational condition, if all the effort is being made to analytically determine which of those hours was being used to deploy the asset, you're now splitting an awful lot of this. And that's a determination that certainly is part of the same culture of sequestration as well as the OCO culture I'm referring to, that get in the way of actually defining what's the broader mission objective, what we're after, that would use any of these increases in ways that would be far more directive. And on the acquisition front, certainly the argument has been advanced that it is time in order to reinvest based on all the data that Andrew has displayed here right before we gathered, that would suggest that's where it needs to go. That said, there is still a robust argument, if you consult the Vice Chief's testimony last week, that say that operationally, it still isn't to the point of acceptable readiness condition, which is dominantly operations related. So, with all that, we start about the same place where your question began. Absent a strategy, we're not really going to see any definition, regardless of what the number is that ultimately comes out of this debate.
Well, you've mentioned strategy a couple times, so I can't help but turn Kath to you. I was going to...
Whenever a former comptroller talks strategy, it warms my heart.
It's getting through.
It's working.
It's getting
right.
through.
Yes.
But I was going to, I was tempted to say something about a budget strategy mismatch, but I guess they can't be mismatched if you don't have a strategy yet. There's a lack or an absence there. But are there implications? I guess so. I'm going to have a question here, I promise.
That's okay.
It's going to be a while, would be my estimate. Maybe
Yeah.
you can opine before we get a strategy.
Yes.
And nonetheless, there's going to be, we're going to have an outcome on 2017. There's going to be a budget soon for 2018 with a little more detail to it. So is it just stasis? Is it just everyone kind of holding their place in line between, if you will, between in the competition of resources, personnel, modernization, readiness, or is it clear that Secretary Mattis is, he's got a priority, he's going to execute it, and the strategy is going to have to catch up when it comes?
Yeah, so oftentimes when we talk, particularly in the United States, about strategies, we think of the formal documentation, if you will, of strategy. And it is not infrequent to have to infer a strategy. This is a particularly bad period in terms of not having in any way a clear administration-wide approach. I don't think you're going to get there. I really don't. Maybe a national security strategy will come out. I know they've hired folks who I think very highly of who are trying to do that. I honestly am not sure that will come, but as you say, if it will come, it's going to come certainly no earlier than the fall. Same with the DoD. DoD is required to do a strategy document under the statute for Title 10. They will do one. Whether it has a lot of buy-in and drives things, I think, is a question. So what do you look at? I think the best thing to look at right now is the Mattis memo that was internal to the department but unclassified and widely shared and published on the priorities for FY 17, 18, 19, essentially a budget document. And he says very clearly, for 17, our priority is readiness. For 18, it's readiness plus, I would say, I would interpret it as having said structure, grow the structure as much as is feasible. Now, one could interpret that as a halt on structure if one thinks it infeasible, but I suspect the intention was to say we want to grow size. And of course, what is the natural bill payer for that strategy? It's modernization, and certainly in terms of major platform purchases in that time frame. It may be that there's a decision to do a heavy investment in S&T, take a break in the next generation and look ahead to the generation beyond. I'll defer to Frank on how to interpret the tea leaves on that. But I think you can infer from the strategy that it is very much rebuild the military is about money into O&M, and it's about growing structure. Now, will that survive? Will that first initial memo survive the reality of the budget situation and the reality of the competitions that exist in the world that might drive us to invest differently than I've just described? I think that's an open question. I don't think that strategy I just described is necessarily the best strategy for the world we live in, nor do I necessarily think it's one that is going to be shared universally through a national security strategy kind of review. If there is a decision to vastly decrease, for example, current operations, I don't think that's going to happen, but it is a potentiality based on what candidate Trump had said. That would drive down the need to spend significantly more in readiness, certainly past 17. I think 17 you're going to have to pay that bill. And does call into question how much more structure, for instance, you would need if you're not using the force as robustly as we have in the past 10 years. So I'll pause there.
Frank, can I get you to just weigh in on how modernization competes in this environment? If force structure grows, there's going to be some demand for at least for acquisition spending, right? You might need more vehicles. You might need, certainly when you're growing Navy fleet, more ships. That drives some acquisition spending. But of course, it may not get at this issue of the pipeline that we talked about.
The budget balance is driven by competing priorities from a lot of different sources. The best indicator you probably have of where the new administration is headed is what they put out as regard to 18 and 17 supplement. 18, they basically are asking for about a 3% increase over what the Obama administration would have asked for. That is not a dramatic increase in defense spending. If you look at the 17 request, the supplemental, they're asking for what Kath said, readiness primarily and production. The concern I have with all of this is that, and I think as the president talks about making the military stronger and larger, he's really talking about larger, and there are numbers of ships that have been talked about in the size of the Air Force or size of the Army. We've had a problem for years, exacerbated by the existence of sequestration. In fact, a major contributor to it was the existence of sequestration, where our budgets have been out of balance. Not the budgets we asked for necessarily, but the budgets we got. And the reason they were out of balance was that we designed a budget around a force structure. And then once you have that and the fixed cost associated with that, then you try to do the best you can with everything else and try to have a balance of readiness, modernization, and the force structure that you're paying for. So we basically kept the larger force structure that we wanted, and we sacrificed in the final budget deliberations some of the other elements. Now, we already took some risk in the department as we submitted each of our budgets over the last several years. So sequestration and getting a lower number by a substantial amount in some cases than we asked for, worse by far in 2013 than the other years, has made that imbalance worse. The part of that imbalance I am most concerned about by a huge margin is the one you point out in your report. It's the lack of investment in products in our new product pipeline. It's the major investments you have to make to develop a program that you're going to field in quantity and produce in quantity. What we were able to do in our last couple of budgets, and Secretary Carter and Deputy Secretary Work both really helped us move in this direction, was to do a number of things to advance technology and to experiment with concepts that could then be taken into products and then fielded and taken into production. We funded the most inexpensive part of the product life cycle, which is the early risk reduction phase. It's proof of principle, basically. It is not a program. Now, all those demonstrations that DIUX is talking about and SCO is talking about, and that the long-range R&D planning activity that Steve Webby, who's here, did, those are all early stage, relatively inexpensive demonstrations. What the department really needs to do is make some decisions about which of those concepts it's actually going to field and to get the money into the budget to move them forward and field them. And that's the shortfall that you pointed out in your report.
Kath, I want to turn to you now on innovation. CSIS had an event last fall on in third offset strategy, which relates to innovation, and you and I also co-authored a piece on innovation recently about the prospects. So I want to just ask you to give us some insights on how innovation is likely to fare with the new administration. They come in, this agenda is in place. I think there's aspects to which it resonates with some of the priorities identified. Other areas is not so clear. So how do you see this kind of evolving, and how does the new administration think through what to embrace and what to modify for their own priorities?
Sure. Similar to the idea of sort of having to infer a strategy sometimes, I think we get a little obsessed on the labels, and often the label makers are the ones who create the obsession. But as we talked about in our recent piece, whether it was transformation or third offset or A2AD or air-sea battle, there are all these terms we have thrown out from the defense community, and people chase that particular labeling and argue maybe a lot about the labeling. I think the imperative we really want to make sure we see is that there is an imperative for innovation. And I do think you'll see that. I think the question really is, as has come out very clearly on the panel, is how well it competes against other constituencies inside the department who will argue for other priorities. All very good people arguing for things for right reasons, right? All looking to advance the defense of the United States. But that innovation community, I think, they would be best set up if they focus less on the branding issues of what we call it, and less the need to repeat the words over and over. I mentioned in the piece we did, transformation in the 2001 QDR, for instance, was used 89 times. So you can just use a word over and over and hope that does it, but I think what we want to see is more effort at the institutional foundational level. I think the big things are, of course, they should be working from their advantages. I think they'll do that. Any smart military will do that. For us in the United States, that's alliances and networks that alliances give us. I'll talk a little bit on the commercial sort of implications of that in a minute. Undersea warfare is another obvious one. Certainly our command and control capabilities, our exquisite sensor capabilities. I think all those are things we ought to be leveraging in order to, pursue advantage against adversaries. And then, as I said, I think a lot of it's this foundational issue set. We may be in a period that's very well set up for this. We have an alignment of party across the chambers of Congress and with the administration. This might be the time to be able to push through some of those really difficult political barriers that have existed, that everyone on this panel has lived through, that relate to innovation, certainly in terms of acquisition reform and helping it be done well. And moving from thinking just about technology to about concepts and innovative cultures and the way you hire and advance personnel in the system. And of course, authorities, any kind of authorities issues. As I said, I think it's about figuring out better ways to partner with allies, with the commercial sector, with defense industry and non-defense industry in the US and abroad, with the labs. Making sure we bring them in as part of part of the dialogue and use them to the best of our ability. So that's what I think ought to be the focus. I do think there'll be a constituency for many of those things, but I think the things to stay away from are too much of an emphasis on the tech side of it without paying attention to all the other constituent pieces that actually are a big piece of what our comparative advantage as the United States will be, is integrating all of that and having this great operational expertise we've developed over years. Many militaries don't have that, and combining that with experimentation, individual initiative, and a promotion system that advances innovation to marry with the technology.
All right, well, we've got some, jump in.
I want to jump in on the innovation subject because it's one I spent an awful lot of time on. Our fundamental strategy in whatever formulation is deterrence, strategic deterrence, conventional deterrence. We try to maintain a military that can deter the threats that we see, so we don't have to go to war and they don't do anything that's too aggressive. And there are lots of ways to formulate that. Kath has worked on that for many, many years. That means you have to have a conventional military that is powerful enough to intimidate people from doing things you don't want them to do. The thing that we need to reconsider, and I think we've been kind of talking around it here, is how America projects power. If you look at the 5 threats that Secretary Carter talked about in his last budget formulation, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and extremist groups, you basically have a spectrum of problems which is very varied, global, and in some cases very significant to the level of being near peer competitors and maybe approaching or will be at peer competitor level. That's a horrible spectrum of things to try to deal with all at once. And so trying to get all of that right. Now, some of those peer competitors or near peer competitors are at work very, very hard at ways to defeat the American way of projecting power. And they've gone way down the path of building things that can do that. So what Kath said about reconsidering how we do business, operational concepts, the way we equip, some fundamentals of the American way of fighting is really needed now. I've been giving speeches for years and years about eroding technological superiority and the need to do something to counter the investments I saw others making to defeat us. That problem hasn't gone away at all, and it's getting worse over time. So the new administration really needs to pick up on the work that was done under the Third Offset Strategy, for example, under the Defense Innovation Initiative, under Better Buying Power 3.0, under all the things we did to try to move that ball forward. Quite frankly, we did not finish the job. We got partway there. We identified some very attractive technologies. We started a number of experiments. We need to make some decisions about specific operational concepts, specific ways of fighting, basically, and then start to buy the equipment to do that. And it's going to be much more difficult than it was earlier in my career when we had a substantial national technological advantage over any potential adversary. The emergence of commercial technologies with widespread military applications that are being invested in largely on a global basis as opposed to a US basis makes that problem much more difficult for us. But it's one we really have to tackle. And I think that's the biggest challenge this administration has. And it's a much more important problem to solve than trying to get more money just to make the forces larger. Making them larger may very well be investing in what Andy Koprenovich, I think, called wasting assets. Things that are obsolete as you're buying them, essentially.
Absolutely.
Sean?
You know, Kath, you and Frank, I think, have really identified what I would summarize as the challenge of a culture of innovation is the greatest thing you've got to get over the hurdle of dealing with. Because the way we're built and trained and focused is to look at what the success ratio is going to be from something you identify as what you made the investment in order to yield some improvement. That drives industry, it drives the public sector towards incrementalism. How do I get that next 15 to 20% of operational utility out of the existing asset or capability or something I already know how to do? How can I improve that as a matter of efficiency or modernize it? And that's rewarded. It's rewarded by the markets, it's rewarded by the annual appropriations process, it's rewarded by every element of how we think of what is a success ratio. And in fact, the penalties for not seeing some improvement has the opposite effect, which is I invested in this, after a year I didn't see anything happen, after a quarter in the industry, or after a quarter of looking at what a defense acquisition review would say, or what your next milestone objective ought to be, or whatever. If you haven't reached it, then we're going to go back to start, or go look at something else, or go invest in some other opportunity that is going to yield that result. That's the real debilitating situation that defeats the very thing that Frank just identified, which is you got to think about what it is you're trying to overcome. Set aside how you've been doing it and figure out what are the range of other ways it could be achieved. That's what our adversaries are doing, is they can't match us dollar for dollar. And that's what's gotten them as far as they have, is thinking about how do I defeat this particular objective by doing something entirely different than what they expect, and that's easy for me to deliver on. And that's the nature of how an awful lot of this has come to be, and the thinking that Frank's talking about that is so essential to really conquering this culture of innovation issue that isn't, you know, a negative to be thinking about efficiency, but it is something that gets in the way of that broader objective being realized that Kath articulated.
I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll turn to audience questions. But Frank, you know, we call our report acquisition trends because we try to do our analysis by looking at data in the contracting system that kind of jumps off the page, you know, trends that persist over time that clearly have significance. A lot of those speak to priorities that you pursued as Undersecretary, some favorably, you know, there has been a real clear reduction in cost growth. Others more, you know, where it's less clear that there was a big impact, and I didn't get into it, but we have a look at competition, and that's been fairly static over time. Competition rates have not moved much. Effective competition rates really vary very little over time. So I just would look for your thoughts on, you know, kind of how do you grade out, you know, success and failure when you look at the data like this?
I think overall we made a lot of progress. I think as you identified, the GAO has, others of our own reports that we put out every year, a lot of objective data. We made, I think, excellent progress at identifying through data things that work and things that don't, and identifying some trends and practices. I think a lot of what you contribute will further that, and I really encourage you to make sure that your report gets wide distribution and that people in acquisition executive positions in particular get to see it. The thing that your tape, your little film did not show, and I'll take a little issue with that, was you talked about contracting. That's a misstatement of what the government does in the acquisition side. We don't just hand the money out to industry. And the essence of what the government does is in part getting the contracts right, as you mentioned, but it's also technical management and managing risk, technical risk in particular through the development process and the life cycle. That's where and how you control cost growth and schedules up and so on. So that's an important skill that the government has to have. Industry basically just responds to whatever we put out for them to do. And then they compete to do it. And if you're not actively managing that from the government's perspective, you're going to have a lot of problems. Okay, I think we did make a lot of progress. I've always believed in incremental improvement to acquisition as opposed to revolutionary changes, the kind of slogans that Kath was talking about in a way. And the data shows, I think, over the several years I stayed there. I stayed that long because I wanted to put policies in place, measure their success, and then be there long enough to keep them consistently in place to show some progress. I thought I did all of that. What I did not succeed in doing was convincing the Congress that that was the right approach. So here we go on another round of acquisition reform. What I'm nervous about going forward is two or three things. I think breaking up the AT&L organization is a mistake. And the essence of that is keeping all the different phases of the product life cycle under one responsible individual. So that the development phase, the production phase, and the sustainment phase are all the responsibility of one individual who takes care to make sure that that balance is right. And I don't know how this will come out in terms of, there's a lot of latitude for the department in the way that the law was written last year on the reorganization, but it does create what are effectively 3 new undersecretaries, all of whom, by the way, have directive authority over the services. So I think that's going to make the services lives a lot more difficult, frankly, than it is already with one person with that authority. There was a perception in the previous year that the bill that passed, the Authorization Act, had shifted a lot of authority to the services. It had the potential to do that, but it also allowed the Secretary a lot of discretion in how he managed that. And when Secretary Carter was there and I was there, we did not fundamentally change the balance of power between OSD and the services. But it's up to this administration how they want to handle that. Before I left, Secretary Carter delegated the Alternative Milestone Decision Authority designation authority to the AT&L, and that's where it is today. So the services can appeal that if they don't like the fact that OSD has retained that authority. I think, frankly, the balance we had is actually the right balance. And what we had in place for 30 years was put there for a very good reason. Goldwater Nichols was reacting to a lot of very serious problems in acquisition, and it decided that some more central authority was needed. And I think that was accurate. And the data that I have and that you've seen shows quite clearly that improvements were achieved as a result of that. Leadership is always an important factor. So getting professionals in place who have the background and the skill set to do the job and the leadership characteristics, frankly, to overcome some of the resistances they have to see. So there's no shortage of ways for additional improvement. I wrote an article for our testers the other day, and I talked about several things that can be done in that area. There's still a lot that can be done to remove bureaucracy. The services contracting area, the sustainment in particular. If I'd done a Better Buying Power 4.0, I'd have focused on that, I think. You point out some things in your report, such as contract type and competition, that need much closer scrutiny. We were aware that competition was not going up in the department about 3 years ago, and I started tracking it much more closely, and I started asking the services to plan ahead for competitions, because competition or not shouldn't be a result that just happens. It should be a result of what you decide to do up front and how you plan your acquisitions. I think there are underlying factors in some of the things you point out in your report that may explain them and are not necessarily negative, but they're certainly worth investigating. We need to understand them. So there's a lot of work left to be done. It is not, quite frankly, and I think I'll go ahead and say this, going to be helped by more rules coming out of the Congress. It's work that has to be done in the department by people who really understand things and know what they're doing and work the details of every individual case of acquisition that they're dealing with, as opposed to broad changes and more general changes that the Congress likes to do. I have a lot of empathy for the point of view of the Congress that they're frustrated that they don't see better results in some cases. And there will always be, given the breadth and scope of what the department does, there will always be an occasional major problem somewhere. So it's not hard to find an example if you want to find an example. But on the other hand, writing general rules that apply to everything is not the way to solve problems within the department. It just isn't that simple. The thing I would ask the Congress to do is hold people responsible. Let people have authority, make it clear who's in charge, and then hold people responsible. And that includes going back several years and dragging people like myself back in 3 or 4 years from now to explain a decision that we made. I mean, the programs that I approve for entry into development for production, for full-scale development, engineering, manufacturing development, I set those programs up for success or failure. But it will take several years to determine whether or not I did a good job of that or not. If it turns out I did a horrible job, I would be perfectly happy to go in and try to work out what went wrong and explain myself to the Congress. I think that's the right approach for them to take, as opposed to trying to tell the professionals in the department how to do their jobs.
I want to open up now to audience questions. We have mics that'll be brought around, and I see one up front here.
Good morning. I'm John Conger. I'm also a senior advisor at CSIS. But I wanted to see if
audience plant, clearly.
Yes, that's right. I wanted to see if y'all could comment on how much of the performance and the data that you see in the report is driven top down by budget constraints and bottom up by requirements and program needs. You look at a lot of this data and it maps to the top line. But how you make up the pie changes as well. How much of this is driven by the dominance of fixed costs driving other things out, and the lack of investment or the lack of money available for investment, and how much of it is a top-down sort of just mapping with the path of the top-line numbers?
I might.
You want me to?
Go ahead.
Yeah. The Federal Procurement Data System, which a lot of analysts use to try to understand what's happening in contracting, is a pretty imperfect data system. It has kind of broad categories. Every contract that's entered into it gets entered as one kind of thing, and many contracts cover a lot of different kinds of work. So there's a lot of fuzz, if you will, in the data because of that. It's also entered by, there's no real audit of the accuracy with which data is put into it, so there are a lot of uncertainties. It basically is following the money as it's spent, as it's put on contract. So, and then as the contracts are executed. So it does give you very useful information, but you have to look at it a little carefully. I was looking in particular, as Andrew was showing his data, at the research and development. Research and development can be put in, because your numbers don't match the budgets, right? You're well aware of that. It can be shown as a service, so it doesn't get binned as R&D. Research and development, which is a basic research grant, for example, would show up that way. But some other things like CETA work on a program, which might be covered by R&D funding, might not show up that way. It show up as a service contract. So there's some fuzz in the data. And you also have to go dig much deeper to get to underlying root causes of some things. I used to have long conversations on services contracting with Dick Jimin about the use of cost plus fixed fee. which turns out to be a pretty good way to do certain types of service contracts. Now, there's a big disparity in your data between what the Air Force, for example, is doing there and what the other services are doing. That bears investigation. And the acquisition executives ought to look into that and try to understand that. So should the DAE. So anyway, you have to dig deeper. But it is a lagging indicator relative to the budgets that people see of what's going on. And there's a lot of ambiguity in the FPDS.
But one thing that I would argue, you look at the decline in R&D spending, I think that's a direct result of sequestration, right?
Yes.
That's an exogenous factor that is unavoidable. The distribution of how that is taken across the different stages of R&D, there was a management choice involved.
Yeah.
There was a choice made to protect early stage R&D, a lot of concern about eating the seed corn, and so policies put in place to say we're going to protect that. Well, okay, you squeeze that part of the balloon, it comes out somewhere else, and so you see that SDD therefore takes the big drop.
Yeah, the Obama administration, no matter what the top line of the budget for defense was, always spent between $10 and $12 billion on science and technology in the Department of Defense. Period. It was completely flat. The 61, 62, 63 accounts. And there were times as we were going through sequestration and taking much deeper budget cuts that I challenged that. Thought I never got to the point of actually advocating it, but I thought, should we take $1 billion or $2 billion out of S&T? Steve Wellby would have shot me. To put it into some of the major development programs and get more money into R&D for actual product development and to have a more healthy balance, if you will, in the structure of the budget. But we never quite got there.
So we've got some of
Dan Fingenstack, Air Force. I had a question. You brought up innovation. You brought up the DIUX and the ways that we're looking at the products that we're building compared to our adversaries. But how do we get innovation into process? Because you showed the horse blanket of the acquisition process. You've got an enormous contracting piece to that, right? And so we have rule of law and transparency concerns that your adversaries don't have. So how do we drive innovation into that and take a risk tolerance approach to writing contracts where we can test things before we actually codify them in law?
The biggest problem I see with contracting is the resource constraints and training levels. The contracting system gives us a lot of latitude in how we write contracts. We were able to get some additional flexibilities from the Congress. We went and asked for some things that they gave us. So we can do some things that really expedite the process. We can also do some things that provide very strong incentives to industry and do that in a way that's well balanced and structured. Performance-based logistics contracts is an example of that. The biggest impediment we have to actually doing those things is the size and the training of the contracting workforce. And one of the biggest drivers on the type of contracts people tend to use is how quick and easy it is for them to put that contract in place. Because everybody in the department that spends money is under pressure to get that money spent on a schedule. And the comptroller here will take your money away from you if you don't spend it on that schedule. So I tried to strike a balance when I was there with my counterparts in the comptroller shop. First Bob Hale and then Mike McCord. We put out a letter together, a joint letter on this about how people were supposed to obligate to their plan. That was an expectation. But that if you didn't, we would not hurt your program just because you hadn't obligated, if there was a good reason why you hadn't obligated. So those pressures come into play too, and they affect how people do contracting as well, and they make it harder for people to be innovative. We tried to rebuild the contracting and the engineering and other parts of the acquisition workforce starting in about 2009. We were pretty far down that trajectory when the budget started to fall. So we had built the workforce up from about 130,000 to roughly 150,000. We were able to hold it flat at that level during the period of the last several years, more or less. It wasn't uniform though. Some of the services tried to take cuts out of their acquisition workforce. And one of the places that those cuts fell was on contracting. And again, that compounds the pressure. Because it doesn't, you just don't have the time. You may not have the training or the experience or the coaching or the mentoring you need to do a more innovative way of doing business. So that's a resource constraint. I heard some testimony yesterday about getting the civilian workforce down in the department. The problem with getting the civilian workforce down in the department is that those people all do something that's useful. And you can replace them with either contractors or military people, or you can not do the work. But there's no free lunch there. So you have to make decisions about that. And I think the biggest obstacle, frankly, to more innovation in the area that you mentioned in contracting is the workforce itself.
I just wanted to add in, going back, very much agreeing, but going back to a point that Sean made earlier, about essentially the carrots and sticks, really the sticks. I think the contracting workforce also lives under an eternal fear of being called up to, I mean, what do you worry about as a contract officer? You worry about being called to task for doing anything that is slightly outside or questionable of the normal practice. So you go to the vehicles, you go to the systems that have not gotten you in trouble in the past, and you crush systematically you crush innovation that way. So contracting improvements, including very much in the workforce, have to be part, again, of this broader way in which we think about bringing innovation to the department. It can't just be finding whiz-bang technology in Silicon Valley that we grab and bring back to DC. That's important, but also is making sure you actually have those less interesting seeming but foundational pieces in place.
Absolutely. I think this is a question of how you define what the deliverable is. What are you looking for? What's the outcome you're trying to establish? And if the answer, the one we gravitate to always is, we're going to get this much of an improvement or that much of a increase in size or volume or whatever, something measurable. And that's always a good thing. That's exactly how we're trained to look at these things. That is not necessarily the full range of the culture of innovation you got to start with, which is, tell me what the objective is. If the objective is, I want to find a different way to achieve this outcome, then you may have a program that includes a multitude of different approaches, one of which may or may not work, maybe all of which will work. But that finite span of time that our tolerance will put up with seeing some result is the greatest enemy in this situation here. And I think the combination of Frank's point of exactly how the workforce views what is success or failure, or how they're penalized for it, as Kath said, is it becomes a deterrent unless you can get out of it. Because otherwise we always gravitate to the lowest denominator of the most measurable and therefore the least productive, potentially, not always, but the least productive outcome of what could be gained from what you spend.
Another factor is that motivates people a lot is fear of protest, fear of losing a protest.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And that leads people to take more conservative approaches and to very carefully document everything they do, which stretches out contracting time. Contracting time has stretched out a lot since my early days in acquisition. The other thing that happens is pressure to get contracts awarded. And I've seen a lot of cases where service leadership, for example, will say, why haven't you awarded that contract yet? And put pressure on the government side to get to a deal as quickly as possible. The idea being that the award of a contract is somehow an indicator of success or progress, I guess. A bad contract is not success or progress. And if you press people to get something done quickly, you won't get as good a business deal, and you won't get as strong incentives for industry. So leadership in the non-contracting world has to appreciate that and understand that and give the people that are doing this work time to do their job.
All right, well, we're going to take one last question here with the gentleman who has the mic.
Yeah, Toby Harshaw from Bloomberg View. This is for private citizen Kendall. The new president came in and with all this talk about a 350 ship Navy and X number of planes for the Air Force and X troop strength, and to many of us that seemed arbitrary and not really based on any threat assessments. I'm wondering, A, do you agree with that, and B, that a president's only in office for 4 to 8 years and these contracts take decades to play out. Is there a chance to sort of correct course if we start off in the wrong direction?
Well, you can always correct course, but you can do a lot of damage in the meantime. The thing that I worry about is getting the balance right. And getting the balance right means that the size of the force is appropriate to support the strategy, that the things that are necessary to support the force and keep it capable, keep it ready and capable, are there adequately, that our installations are adequately taken care of, that the different elements that comprise the enterprise are all funded in right proportion to have the force in being and the ability to expand that force if necessary, that you're going to want over time as you try to manage risk over time, depending upon how you see things evolving in the world. The planning process tends to do is a 5-year incremental process in the Pentagon. But the strategic look that people like Kath did goes out much longer than that. And I think some creative thinking about how risks are evolving in the world and in what direction and where we see them. And the Defense Department we want to have today, tomorrow, and beyond. And how we balance our investments to ensure that we have that risk managed over time is a very difficult task that just needs to be addressed. New administration needs to get its people on board and tackle that. Because their first real opportunity is not going to be the 18 budget. There's no time for that. It's going to be the 19 budget, but even that is fast upon us. The numbers I'm hearing now for 19 budget are for the services to have their draft budgets in September, which only gives you a very, very little time to adjust. Now that's intended to be, I think, so that there's some response to the strategy that's coming out, right? But there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done there. And I think it's a huge mistake to just put some arbitrary numbers down and say we're going to try to be bigger because bigger is better. It isn't necessarily. Bigger can actually be worse. And you need to be careful about that.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to let you know that, as I mentioned, on our website, you'll find the video that we showed. You'll find a link to the analytic tools on the web to look at FPDS data and enjoy its strengths and weaknesses as described by Frank on your own. And also you can download our report if you weren't able to get it here in person, or you can order, if you want the glossy copy, you can order that as well. And please join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion.